Chapter 5. The Long Lake. It had rained again in the night, a fact that was of little consequence to Peppercorn and his crew of orphans. With the exception of the odd drip that had worked its way down through the shingles of the roof to drop upon their dozing heads, they had all slept soundly enough, oblivious to the weather or indeed any other concerns in the world outside of their snug and cosy bed closet. "I could get used to sleeping in a bed," said Cresson, who was sat up in the one he had been sharing with both Vane Giles and Baldwin Pyecrust, stretching out the sleep from his waking limbs and rubbing it away from his long neck. "Well, I suggest you don't," replied Peppercorn philosophically. "That way there'll be less chance of your being disappointed." It didn't take long for the boys to ready themselves, since they had each slept fully dressed as was their habit. Peppercorn was the only one of the six to avail himself of the jug of cold water that Chubb had provided for the purpose of washing. They found the mage downstairs already, awaiting their arrival at the candlelit table in a corner of the still dark common room, with a breakfast of fried eggs, fresh bread, buttered mushrooms and small ale. He had roused the landlord before the first cock had crowed in order to prepare their simple meal, and with these duties now fulfilled, Chubb rested upon his stool, leaning upon the counter, his head resting in his hands, snoring occasionally to confirm his being once more fast asleep. "The old man may be mad," thought Peppercorn as he settled himself at the furnished table, "but whilst he is happy to continue providing board and lodging for me and mine, then who am I to deny him his fantasy?" And with that thought uppermost in his mind, he prepared himself for a hearty breakfast. "Just one small matter before we eat," said Elisanda, raising a finger before his face, all eyes suddenly intent upon him. "There is no easy way for me to say this. As we sat at supper last eve, I could not help noticing something of a collective aroma. Indeed, I suspect much of your failure to land fish has a little to do with your smell driving them off." This observation was met by a deal of harumphing and well-I-nevering from the affronted boys. "Now, if I am to live these next few weeks, cooped up with you like fish in a barrel," the mage continued, "then I would rather you did not smell like fish. Therefore, I should be obliged if you would do something about it." "What do you mean?" asked Baldwin in a voice that suggested both indignation and injured feelings. "How dare you?" added Giles resentfully. "I don't have to stand for that." "Actually, you do," said Peppercorn matter-of-factly. "Since it's Elisander's gold that's paying for this venture, not to mention board and lodging, the least he can expect in return is to be able to breathe." "What? But you—" began Giles. "No buts, Giles, you stink, as do the rest of us. It is a very simple and reasonable request. And besides," added the old man, "no one eats until you have washed." With such an ultimatum, and the mushrooms cooling in the pan, no further entreaty was needed. Returning to the jug and bowl in their bedchamber, though not without much complaining and murmuring en route, there began a frenzy of hurried lathering and washing, each boy stripped to the waist and experiencing a brick of soap for the first time in as long as any of them were happy to admit to. The sky was void of clouds that morning, a welcome reprieve after the storms and rainfall that had been on and off for the past week. Still, the air of the lake was cool and necessitated the wearing of thick cloaks and scarves. For Pepper and his boys, who had neither woolen cloak, nor scarf, this meant making do as best they could. Peppercorn and Dimmock both wore an oily poncho made from an old, soiled blanket. For the others, it meant wrapping themselves as best they could with strips of old sailcloth and threadbare blanket, tied around waist and chest with something of the effect of funerary wrappings. They made their way by foot to the postern, where the farthing was moored, and where the wharves and jetties of the old harbour near the Seine Gate were busy with fishing crews preparing their boats for the off. When he saw the farthing tethered at the jetty, looking not unlike a toy in comparison to the much larger fishing ketches, Elisander wondered that it remained afloat at all, for it appeared in great need of repair, or else of scuttling and starting afresh with new timbers. Though he had seen it the previous day, he had not really considered it with the scrutiny of one who would soon be sailing in it. Now, with their imminent voyage uppermost in his mind, the mage inspected the farthing with a deal more care. "Looks can be deceiving," said Peppercorn as he helped the old man up the narrow plank that led from quay to vessel, reading the concern on the mage's face. "She may be a bit patched and repaired, but she is sound enough and will do the job at hand as well as any one of the master's cogs." Elisander doubted this very much, for he had seen the splendour and luxury of the state vessels, but he did not say as much and contented himself that if his young crew had faith enough in the boat, then it would no doubt be sufficient for him too. Once safely aboard, the boat seemed smaller than the old man had imagined, although, as the boy later pointed out, that is the wonder of such a vessel, for every inch of space, every nook and cranny was ingeniously employed for stowage, so there was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. Indeed, almost immediately, the mage had noted what a tight ship young Peppercorn ran, how orderly the small boat was kept, and how organised were his crew once aboard, for they all had a job to do and were eager to be about it, and in this vein were they soon ready to embark. "One more thing before we leave," said the mage, and he pointed to a number of small oak firkins, 12 in all, stacked one atop the other, in something of a pyramid formation upon the jetty, hard against the door of a tall net shed. "We will be needing these," he continued, explaining that he had borrowed them from Chubb, if indeed it can be called borrowing when 2 silver coins were exchanged for the loan. "So, if you wouldn't mind bringing them aboard, I would be much obliged." They did not ask any questions. Peppercorn was content to humour the old man in exchange for his hospitality in gold, and so they set about it. It did not take the boys long at all, passing the barrels one to another in a chain from jetty to deck and then down through the hatchway into the hold. By now the sun was beginning to peep above the eastern horizon, and the Laketown fishing fleet was eager to get out onto the lake, to make the most of the clement weather. As one after another of the boats readied for their morning's work, they slipped calmly away from the jetties. The birds of Laketown too were busying themselves around the postern, making their presence known with screeching and crying and barracking, and gulls and kittiwakes alike followed the fishing boats as they sailed out of the harbour. Black Nickel unhitched the mooring line that tied the farthing to the dock, threw it across the gunwales and followed it aboard, leaping in one bound from quay to weather deck. With a gentle breeze in the single sail, flapping the little bird that the missus had stitched as a gift upon the flag, the boat slid out of the harbour and onto the lake. Being the captain of the small boat, it fell to Peppercorn to act as steersman, and so, taking the tiller, he piloted the farthing safely out of the harbour, out onto the calm of the post-storm lake, following the rest of the fishing fleet into the hazy glow of the rising sun before leaving them to turn north. With the breeze in his black hair and the morning before them, Peppercorn could not suppress a smile to think how Grubb would be short-handed for the morning and might actually have to do some work himself for a change. Pepper knew that by now the Bitter Hope would be heading toward the deepest waters and would soon be hauling in the first of her nets, dividing the catch as it came aboard into an array of baskets. He would be missed, that much he knew, and not only him but Baldwin too, and Master Grubb would be furious for their truancy. The fish needed to be ready for the market as soon as they landed. The freshest fish demanded the highest prices, and so each day, not only did the fishermen of Laketown race to be the first out of the harbour and the first with their nets in the water, but they also raced to be the first to land their catch on the quayside and to have them on the market stalls and in the shopping baskets of the housewives of Laketown. And if the mage were true to his word, Peppercorn need not work for Grubb, or anyone else for that matter, for a good many months, if not years. Peppercorn and his crew were never happier than when they were afloat. Like all children of Laketown, they had grown up either in or upon the water. It was not unheard of for Laketown children to be able to swim before they could walk, and many had their own small rowboats, skin-covered coracles and such like, which they would punt, pole and paddle around the play ponds and canals of the city. For a while, Pepper held them in sight of land, keeping it to their starboard, where they passed within view of the odd building that edged the western shore and the 2 great prison hulks that were anchored 100 yards or so from the bank. Often Peppercorn thought he was destined to find himself locked up in the belly of one of those colossal vessels. Great boats without masts or sail, for they never moved from the spot where they were moored, anchored as they were offshore to house the thieves and smugglers of Laketown, not to mention those who attracted the master's displeasure. Though Peppercorn had absolute faith in his little boat, he was secretly happy when the ragged green fringe of the bank was still in sight, for the farthing was a small vessel, and if the weather were to turn again, could be easily swallowed up by the lake. This way he felt comforted that, should some misfortune befall them, he and his boys could at least make it back to the shore aright. He could not be so certain of the mage, however. They continued north in this way, Laketown slowly receding to their stern, all the while trailing a wispy ribbon of pipe smoke which emanated from the long-stepped pipe of the mage, who sat cross-legged upon an upturned wooden chest, puffing away as if he hadn't a care in the world. And as morning passed into noontime and on into afternoon, Laketown slipped by degrees beneath the southern horizon and beyond the powers of their naked eyes. At length Peppercorn tied off the tiller arm in order for the farthing to hold a straight course. "I think it's long past due we discussed our fee for this little venture of yours," he addressed the mage. It was a question that had been playing on his mind since they had pushed off that morning. "Cheese and capons is all very well." "Not to mention feather beds and a roof over our heads," interrupted Baldwin, not very helpfully, the memory of a good night's rest still fresh in his mind. "Not to mention feather beds," continued Peppercorn, giving his friend a reproachful look. "But if I remember rightly, you said something about treasure beyond our wildest dreams." "That's right, Pep," agreed Dimmock encouragingly. The mage listened calmly and without any apparent concern, but continued to draw upon his pipe, each time blowing out a long, thick stream of billowing white smoke. "Your pay, my good sirs," he announced at length, "is down there." And so saying, he pointed a bony finger down over the side of the small boat toward the black water. "More riches, more treasures and more wealth than you could ever imagine or wish for." "Now just you hold on a minute," demanded Peppercorn indignantly. "Are you trying to get one over on us? You said we'd be paid in gold. And so you shall. Gold, silver, diamonds, rubies, all. But as I say, it is down there." And he pointed once more over the side into the dark waters of the lake. "And if you listen closely, I shall tell you how you might find it." The boys were too flabbergasted to argue or interrupt, and so the mage continued. "Do you know the tale of Smaug the dragon?" he asked, as if he were telling them a bedtime story. Of how the great fire drake was brought down by Bard the Bowman as the old city of Esgaroth burned? Of course I know the tale, replied Peppercorn impatiently, for he was beginning to think now of the morning's pay he could have been earning with grub, and he feared that the day would turn out to be unfruitful and wasted after all. Everyone knows it, added Dimmock. It's part of our history. Every child of Laketown did indeed know the tale of Bard the Bowman, learnt it at their mother's knees, and those that had no mother seemed to drink it from the very water, breathe it in the air and pluck it from the wind that billowed the white sails of the fishing fleet. Everyone knows the tales of Bard, confirmed Baldwin Piecrust. Then pray tell it to me, said Elissander, sitting back upon his chest, as if to make himself comfortable to hear a story. What do you mean? Asked Peppercorn suspiciously, suspecting that the old man was somehow having fun at his expense. You know it already. Humour me, if you please. Imagine I know nothing of the tale, said the mage, and he continued to puff upon his pipe and gaze up at the blue sky as if they were embarking upon a pleasure cruise. Well, OK then, conceded Peppercorn. Let's see. Smorg the Golden, hearing of the great wealth of the dwarf folk of Erebor, left the withered heath and took up residence in the halls of the dwarf king. King Thror, said the mage. That's the fellow, agreed the boy, matter-of-factly, and here the dragon made a great nest of treasure. A mound of treasure so great that a man would have to scale its sides like a mountain, added the mage. A lot of treasure, Peppercorn agreed. 100 or so years later, the grandson of the king, Thorin Oakenshield, added the mage once more. Thorin Oakenshield, agreed the boy. He sets out ahead a company of 12 of his dwarf brothers, with the aim of killing the dragon and winning back the halls of the king, his grandfather, along with Smorg the Magnificent's golden jewels. Very good, applauded the mage. Keep going, if you please. Thorin's burglar, a hairy little creature named Bilbo, a hobbit, I believe. A hobbit, corrected the mage. Yes, a hobbit, agreed the boy. He enters the Lonely Mountain by way of a secret door, disturbing the dragon, who flies into a terrible rage and lights the mountain, intent on destroying and burning all the towns and cities around and about. Quite so, and what next? Asked the mage. The city nearest the Lonely Mountain was Laketown. Not the closest, corrected Elissander. Dale lies closer than Laketown, but Smorg had already decimated that great city. So Smorg flies across the long lake, continued Peppercorn, and giving vent to his wrath, begins to shower the city with flame and fire. And what, pray tell, did the good people of that great city do to defend themselves against this Smorg? The city guards load the great bows mounted atop the city's walls and begin to fire upon the dragon, whilst teams of bowmen rattled their arrows against the armoured scales of the dragon's flanks. And were they successful in bringing down the dragon with their arrows and darts? Asked Elissander. They were not, said the boy emphatically, coming now into his stride. The dragon's skin was so encrusted with gold and gems upon which he had reclined those many years that they formed a kind of armour, repelling the arrows of the archers, rendering their efforts futile. Correct, exclaimed the mage, stabbing the air with his pipe, pleased to have arrived at this crucial point in the story. A quantity of the coin and precious stones and golden trinkets of the dragon's hoard had lodged themselves within the scales of his flesh, forming an extra coating of armour. Until Bard the Bowman notices a spot at the dragon's throat, added Baldwin, who particularly liked this part of the story. An unprotected spot, pointed out by a talking bird, and he hits it fair and square with one of his shafts, bringing the dragon down into the lake. And the boy clapped his hands excitedly, as if the dragon were being brought down anew right before their eyes. Exactly. And those same jewels, explained the mage, that had encrusted Smorg's scaly hide, have lain down there at the bottom of the lake until this day. And so saying, he pointed once more over the boat's side to the black waters beneath. Except, added Cresson. Yes, asked the mage, an eyebrow raised in anticipation of the boy's reply. Except, it's not true, is it? Said Cresson. It's naught but a fairy tale, and none of it ever really happened, did it? Ah, well, said the mage cautiously, that's where I beg to disagree. You really expect us to believe all that nonsense about dragons and dwarves? Asked Giles in a tone of disbelief. There's no such thing as dragons, piped up Cresson, adding his penny's worth to the argument. I would like you to believe it, admitted the mage, and if you cannot, I expect you to believe that I believe it, and hope that that is enough. I know a song about it, said Baldwin enthusiastically. Without further bidding, he launched into his rendition of it. The trees were burning on the hill, the winds were blowing cold and sure, the fires were red, the flames they spread like torches fringed with fiery fill. The bells rang out across the vale, and men looked up full feared and pale. The dragon's ire, and here he forgot the words. Something and the fire, something their towers and houses burned. But he did not get much further before he realised he'd forgotten the words completely, and so his song quickly petered out. Quite so, said Elissander dismissively. So you are a treasure hunter? Asked Peppercorn, a little disappointed. In a manner of speaking, Elissander replies. I suppose you could say that, if you must. You see, there was an item that had found its way into Smorg's golden bed, a curious piece. Some say a magical stone, though I doubt it was of any great value. Yes, the Arkenstone of Thrain, said Peppercorn, recalling once more the story. The heart of the mountain. The Arkenstone was not the only precious stone in Smaug's hoard, explained the mage, his pipe now smoked out. There was another, smaller and less conspicuous than the dwarfish jewel. This one item is all that interests me. The rest is yours to divide between you. And he tapped out the ashes of his pipe on the side of the boat to fall into the black waters. That sounds very generous, said Giles, but may I point out that all of nothing is still nothing, and a sixth part of nothing is likewise nothing. Ignoring the boy's scepticism, Elisander reached into his sleeve and withdrew a folded piece of parchment upon which was inked a diagram. Smoothing it upon his knee, he held it up before the boy's eyes to see. This is the stone I seek, he explained. It is called the Abator. It is a talisman of ancient date. The diagram showed a disc of rough stone with the stylized symbol of an eye carved in relief in the centre. It doesn't look like much, said Dimmock, still scrutinising the image. As I said, it is a trinket, nothing more. A charm, a bringer of good luck, said the mage. Didn't bring Smaug much luck, guffawed Cresson. Oh, that old worm had luck enough, said Elisander. He lived for many years, more than he deserved. Who knows, maybe his luck finally ran out. No, it is a trifle really, but it has, shall we say, sentimental value. But the tales tell of mountains of gold and precious things. That's how they came to call him Smaug the Golden, for his wealth was so great, recited Giles. And they tell of how it was all carved up between the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain and the elven folk of Mirkwood, added Peppercorn, not to mention paying for the rebuilding of Laketown. True, 'tis but a tiny fraction of the treasure the worm had hoarded in his great halls of Erebor. Nevertheless, if the records tell it true, there would be treasure enough at the lake's bottom to make some industrious person, or persons, and here he paused and looked deliberately at each of the young companions in turn, very rich indeed. Those last words the old mage left hanging in the air like some delicious fruit, ripe for the picking, as if all Peppercorn need do was to reach out, twist it free and take it for his own. And he was tempted, who wouldn't be? So let's say it's all true, said Dimmock. The dragon, the dwarves, the gold, all of it. Exactly how much gold and jewels could his armour hold? It's impossible to say exactly, said Elisander, but it is written that the gold and jewels are as thick upon his scales as tenfold shields, though I do not doubt but that is vastly exaggerated. In truth, I do not know. How much gold does it take to cover a dragon? How big is a dragon anyway? I certainly do not know. But if you wish to turn your nose up at free gold, continued the old man rather nonchalantly, gold that is simply lying there for the taking, because you fear the quantity will not be sufficient for your needs, then clearly I have made a grave mistake in choosing you for the job, and those who suggested you to me have played a cruel trick, for you must already be wealthier than Dane himself. If it's down there, Peppercorn asked dubiously, why has no one tried before now to retrieve it? Who says no one has tried, said the mage with a shrug. Who could know how many men have perished trying to get the dragon's treasure? That they do not advertise their endeavours is hardly surprising considering what is at stake. And on that note, I should warn you all of the need for circumspection. I am not alone in my interest in the talisman. There are forces abroad, dark forces, who follow my every move and stalk my every step. Many times during my searching, I have sensed their malign presence, have felt them attendant at my every turn. And now I am close to my goal, they are close at hand, and we must be on our guard. But you say there is a wealth of treasure to be found in the dragon's watery grave. Surely there is enough to share with those who pursue you, suggested Giles. Pursue us, Elisander corrected. No, they have no interest in treasure. There is but one item they seek. I know the stories, said Peppercorn finally, but that's what they are. Just stories, nothing more. There's no truth to it. What short memories men do have, the mage lamented, shaking his head. The struggle against Morgoth, the generations of the Four Ages, the battle for the ring and the rule of the Istari, all forgotten, all unremembered, consigned to obscurity and labelled myth. Elisander paused, pursing his lips for a moment and setting his jaw, and then, sighing heavily, continued. Let me assure you, my young detractors, I have travelled to the lands of the distant north, the lands now frozen where men in furs ride the great snowfields in chariots drawn by dogs, the lands where once had dwelt the heroes of the Second Age. I have visited the many islands of Beleaguer, the great western ocean that lies betwixt Middle-earth and the undying lands of the immortals. I have searched far and wide for the writing and wisdom of the ancients, and have discovered much and more, and they all agree, without exception, on the existence of dragons. And not only dragons, but elves, dwarves, and wizards too. Dragons and fairies and wizards and dwarves, I know there are those that believe in those things, said Peppercorn in a tone that suggested he doubted the soundness of mind of such people. But I've seen precious little evidence of them in my lifetime. Though it saddened the mage to hear it, the boy's disbelief did not altogether surprise him. He came across such attitudes wherever he went. There was amongst the cities of men, especially among the younger generations, a growing scepticism, and unbelief on the question of the existence of dragons and dwarves, not to mention other magical folk. Those stories of the Valar and the elves of Mirkwood were well known and still rehearsed in the taverns and around the heart of Laketown. There were many agnostics who considered them nothing more than fantastical stories, good only for the entertaining of children on cold winter's nights. I know there was not a one among the people of Laketown, young or old, who, like these boys, did not know or could not recite the legends of Bard the Bowman and his defence of the town against the fearsome dragon. Most considered it naught but a tall tale. And the verdigris-covered bronze of the bowman that stood upon the plinth in the town square? Nothing but a figure of fiction. Yes, they would concede if pressed, there may once have been a man named Bard, sometime long ago, deep in the depths of history, and yes, he may have been a figure of note once upon a long time ago, but the very idea of there having ever been a dragon was, to put it plainly, ridiculous. "Tell me, Peppercorn, exactly how old are you?" inquired the mage. "Oh, I don't know exactly," Peppercorn admitted. 12, 13, 14 years maybe. "And do you mean to say that in your 12, 13, or maybe 14 years, you've seen all that there is to see between heaven and earth, have you? Seen all the wonders of Middle-earth, all the creatures and beasts that live therein, the secret and hidden marvels? Seen all the mysteries of hill and dale, mountain and shire, forest and field? Is that what you're trying to tell me, Master Peppercorn?" He tapped his empty pipe upon the palm of his hand while awaiting the boy's reply. Peppercorn looked sheepish. "Well, okay," he conceded. "Maybe not everything exactly." "No, maybe not everything," agreed the mage, "and on such questions you would do well to speak a little less and listen a lot more if our enterprise is to succeed." "Well, I don't know if I want any part in your enterprise," bristled the boy, his feelings clearly hurt by the old man's brusqueness. "Not if I'm going to be spoken to like that, and on my own boat too." Come now, smooth your ruffled feathers. I didn't mean to cause offence," Elisanda soothed. "Just remember, if you will, that you are but young, and there is much that you, and I for that matter, do not know about the wide world. If you are to assist me in this venture, then you have a lot to learn." "I do not like that word, assist," interrupted Peppercorn. "It implies some manner of voluntary labour, that I am doing it out of the goodness of my heart, which I am not, and I'd thank you to remember it." "I have told you, Master Peppercorn, I am not here for your charity. You will be paid for your part in this venture, and paid well, in all probability better than you deserve." Peppercorn looked a little hurt by the old man's observation. Baldwin, meanwhile, had continued to hum absent-mindedly the tune of the song whose words he had forgotten. "I still say it's nothing but fictions and fairy tales," insisted Giles. "I don't know," interjected Baldwin, breaking off from his humming. "You know I saw a mere maid once, bathing amongst the shallows on the south shore near Safe Harbour." "Oh, no, not that one again," exclaimed Cresson gleefully, and the friends all laughed and nudged each other playfully. "I did," insisted Baldwin, clearly hurt by his friend's disbelief. "And she was beautiful to behold," he added rather dreamily. "You saw naught but your own reflection," insisted Giles, "and that weren't no beauty to behold, I'll wager." And they all laughed once more, except, of course, for Baldwin, who looked more than a little crestfallen. "There are more marvellous things in Middle-earth than mere folk," assured the mage, pointing reproachfully at them with the long stem of his pipe. "And if you would but open your mind and your eyes, you might see more of them yourselves." And he winked kindly at Baldwin, who seemed to cheer at the unexpected but much appreciated support of the old man. "There is much and more under heaven and earth than you have experienced inside the walls of Esgaroth," Elisanda continued. "I know of the little folk who live to the west, beyond the forest and the mountains," said Cresson, rubbing his long neck awkwardly, uncomfortable to be admitting such a thing in front of his friends, seeing how they had served Baldwin. I know them well," said the mage. "They are the hobbits of the story, and a marvellous race they are too." "But I have never seen one, nor have I ever seen a hawk," Cresson continued, "and from what I've heard of their kind, I don't never want to neither." "Orc," corrected Elisanda again. "So you've heard of hobbits and orcs, but short of that there are only men living in the whole of Middle-earth." "I didn't say that," retorted the boy defensively. "But are you saying you want us to believe in elves and pixies and dwarves and dragons?" "That is exactly what I am saying," Alexander exclaimed. "They are our history, they are our reality, and if you join with me in this business, you will see things stranger and more unbelievable than those creatures you mention. And if you do not believe in them now, how then will you defend yourself against them when the time comes?" Peppercorn looked thoughtful, but still dubious. "I don't know," he said. "It's a lot to ask to believe in such things." "Oh, I do not expect you to merely believe, Peppercorn. I'll prove it to you if you will only listen and follow my instructions." "In the stories I heard," said Cresson, "the dragon's resting place was supposed to be cursed." "Well, yes," agreed Elisanda, pleased that at least one of these boys was willing to make this small concession. "It was, as you say, believed of old that the bones of the fallen dragon were cursed with bad luck, and in the early days of the rebuilding of the city, no one would dare to sail a boat over the spot where they lay." "Well, what I was wondering is this," continued Cresson. "If Smorg really did exist, as you say he did, and now lies with his treasure at the bottom of the lake. Are we safe to go looking for him?" At this, the rest of the boys fell quiet and very thoughtful. Considering none of them really believed in the story of the dragon, they all looked very thoughtful at the mention of a curse. "Oh, quite safe, assured Elisanda a little too quickly, and not altogether convincingly for Dimmock's sake. "Since to retrieve the treasure you must also disturb the bones, you may as well extend the curse, if indeed there was one, to the treasure itself, but I shouldn't go losing any sleep over it. Personally, I put no stock in such tales." "Well, that's easy for you to say," said Dimmock emphatically, "for 'tis not you shall be swimming around amongst them." So saying, he looked toward Peppercorn as the one who would be filling this particular function. "Not as easy as you might think," corrected the mage. "You forget, I'm as much a part of this adventure as the rest of you, and if the treasure be cursed, I'm as likely as any of you to fall foul of its bane, since I too will be handling the treasure and living upon the boat wherein it will be contained." The boys nodded or else pursed their lips as if weighing up his words and raised their eyebrows in agreement. "And it has clearly not occurred to you," the mage continued, rather pointedly, "that of the 6 of us, I am the only one who actually believes in the story of the dragon, and am therefore most susceptible to any curse that there may or may not be." And with that their discussion ended, for the mage had a pipe to refill and rekindle, and the boys all had work and a good deal of thinking to do. They continued in this way for most of what remained of the day, a gentle but consistent breeze ushering them through the waters. "How deep do you think it is?" Peppercorn asked, hanging over the gunwale beside the rudder arm, staring down into the blackness and beyond. "Don't know," replied Crescent. "Reckon it's as deep here as anywhere," he added unhelpfully. No one really knew the true depth of the Long Lake, created as it was during the years of the break-up of the lands, when the world was in upheaval at the time of the destruction and recreation of Arda. Some claimed it to be deeper at its deepest places than any other of the inland waters of Middle-earth, deeper than Lake Evendim, deeper even than the great Sea of Run. Whether or not this was true, Peppercorn did not know, nor to his knowledge did anyone else, but he had taken soundings many times before, both on his own boat and upon Grubb's, and the measure had often run out at a mile or more of line. Of course, like any landscape, the bottom of the lake varied over its expanse, shallower in some places, deeper in others, but what its depth at its deepest, as I say, no one knew. "Pass me the lead," Peppercorn said to no one in particular. Black Nickel reached beneath the bench upon which he perched and drew out a wooden trunk, he being the closest. Lifting the lid, he took out a spool of thin rope, along the length of which were tied ribbons of ragged red silk, and on the end of which hung a deep plummet in the shape of a teardrop. Taking it from him, Peppercorn let the plummet drop with a plop into the dark water, where it sank quickly through the murk, the line running through his fingers with a soft whir, and together they counted the red markers as one by one they broke the water's surface. But before the plummet reached the lake's bottom, the line came to its last marker. "Well," proclaimed Peppercorn as he began to wind the line back onto its spool, "this line's 20 fathoms long, and it's a deal deeper than that." "Rather you than me swimming down there," said Dimmock, speaking aloud the thoughts of each of the boys. That night the lake was calm and still, presage, so Elisanda hoped, of the success to come in the following days. And as they lay at anchor, swaying gently upon the sinuous undulation of the lake's surface, sat upon the deck of the little boat, they smoked a pipe or two of leaf, blowing smoke rings and clouds of satisfaction into the night sky. Baldwin produced a painted board of rough pine marked with a checkered pattern, and discs of black horn and white bone for the playing pieces, and they took it in turns to play gammon by the light of a swaying lantern. Elisanda lit his pipe and pored by lantern light over his books, sometimes underlining passages with a stub of pencil, other times scribbling notes onto other scraps of paper. After observing the mage work for a while, seeing how absorbed in the different writings he was, Peppercorn said, "I see you read much, Elisanda. Though they be in characters I do not know, do you have any other languages?" The mage paused for a moment, raising his eyes from the book upon his lap to consider the boy's question. "Let me see," he mused. "I know some Feanorian and some Elvish, both Sindarin and Quendi, some Westron and a little Adunaic. I am working presently on Rohirric, though it is an incomplete system, for the Rohirrim wrote little and recorded less. Dwarvish runes are my favourite. I can also read some of the Eastern languages," he added, "Runish, Candish and the like, but they do not come easy to me." And so saying, he returned to his studies. And while the boys and the mage busied themselves with books and pipes and gammon board, Peppercorn took a moment to stand alone upon the deckhouse above the cuddy and to wonder at the beauty and immensity of the night sky. You see, night time upon the lake was different to night time on the land. In the city there were buildings all around, or trees and mountains in the countryside. There the sky only began above these landmarks, above the rooftops and the towers, above the chimney stacks and the steeples. It was as if the buildings separated the land from the sky, as if they separated him from the sky. But on the lake it was different. On the lake the sky was not only above him, but it was all around him, for it extended unimpeded from the firmament above right down to the water's surface. There was nothing but the horizon to separate the lake from the sky. With no land to mark the boundary between earth and sky, no mountains or forests to highlight the horizon and divide the heavens from the land, he was engulfed, subsumed into heaven's vault. He was in the sky, and the sky was all around him in every direction. And the stars were not just above him, they were to left and to right, before and behind, and he was amongst the stars. And as he stood alone upon the deckhouse that night, it felt as if he could simply reach out a hand and pluck a star like a glittering jewel from its cradle in the velvet firmament. Before retiring to their various berths, it was agreed that they would break their fast the next morning on whatever was left over from their evening meal, some cold beer, black bread and cheese, a little after dawn, in order to make the most of daylight hours for the work they were to undertake. It had also been agreed that, since it was Elisander's gold that was paying for the trip, that it was only right and proper that it should be Elisander himself who enjoyed the relative comfort of the small captain's cuddy, and Peppercorn, in deference to the mage's many years of seniority, had agreed to take a hammock in the cargo hold of the 'tween decks, along with the rest of the crew. And when he lay down that night, wrapped within his hammock, swaying gently with the continual rhythm of the lake, Peppercorn reflected upon all that Elisander had said that day. When he finally closed his eyes to sleep, he did so with a resolve to be more open-minded uppermost in his thoughts. It was a little before sunrise that Peppercorn awoke and made his way quietly past his sleeping crew up to the deck of the Farthing. It was a beautiful thing, he thought to himself, to be upon the lake of a morning when the world, but seemingly none of its inhabitants, was just waking. When the winds were still abed, so nothing stirred, leaving the lake as flat and smooth as glass. At such times a calmness and a stillness pervaded, an otherworldliness, Peppercorn thought, as if he were the only living thing upon the lake, indeed the only living thing throughout Rovanian and all Middle-earth, or so it seemed. And he did not feel troubled at being so alone, but instead cherished these moments of quiet solitude at the breaking of a new day. Since Peppercorn was the first one up, he thought it expedient that he should begin breakfast, and as he busied himself about the small galley, lighting the little stove and enjoying the warmth of it in the morning chill, he considered what Elisander had said the previous day, for it had begun to puzzle him. That all the people of the city knew the tales of the dragon Smorg, or at least a version of them, it was true. There were many tales and traditions of dragons amongst the people of Laketown. Furthermore, you could see evidence of Laketown's historic association with the dragon throughout the city. There were plenty of references to dragons in the street names and in the names of taverns and alehouses. There was the dwarf and the dragon on Thimble Lane, the sleeping dragon on Stanton's Bridge, the dragon's hoard beside the fish market at Petershead, and the dragon and trumpet near the assizes in the Sinistral, to name but a few. There were songs of dragons and stories of dragons too, sung in the snugs and told in the parlours of the city. Some told of the dragon Smorg of whom Elisander had spoken, and some featured other dragons of renown, the South Harbour dragon, the golden dragon of Run, the dragon and the fisherman, and Redbeard and the dragon of Tame. But surely that did not mean there were any truth in the old stories. Certainly, it had never occurred to Peppercorn that there might be any truth in them. And that was not all. The city had adopted the symbol of the dragon as its standard many years ago, and as such there was the outline of a supine dragon upon the tabards of the men of the watch, signifying, or so it said, their latent power. There were flags bearing the like emblem flying from the tops of all the city's towers, while a rampant dragon adorned the official seals of both the master and the provost. Then there was the statue of Bard the Bowman, the first master of the rebuilt cities of Laketown and Dale, and supposed slayer of the dread Smorg. This could be found in the public square at the foot of the monument, and though he had not seen it for himself, for Peppercorn had never been there, it was said that a second statue of the bowman, an exact likeness of this one, could be found in the market square at Dale. All that being said, no one actually believed the story of the dragon. Yes, the city had been destroyed, according to the chronicles, several times in the past, and yes, it was very possible, if not probable considering the city's timber construction, that on at least one of these occasions it was actually burned down. But by dragon fire? Peppercorn had always doubted it before. Not that he was naturally unbelieving, he was not. He wanted to believe Baldwin's story about seeing a mermaid. He wanted to believe, like Halfpenny did, in all kinds of magical and wonderful things, but the evidence of his life to date had shown that there was very little wonder or magic in the real world. That is what he was, he said to himself, a realist. Believing in dragons did not put food in your belly. Believing in wizards and magic did not keep the wolf from the door. Let Halfpenny and Baldwin believe in magic and magical creatures. Let the good men believe in miracles. Until he saw evidence of either one, he would keep his feet firmly upon the ground and his head out of the clouds. And yet, it kept a nagging at him, and would not let him rest. He had dreamed that night of dragons, though the details of that dream he had not brought with him into the waking. And now, as he busied himself about the galley, lighting the little stove and preparing the necessities for breakfast, the question of the dragon mithered him still. Elisanda was next to rise, and he stepped out into the dark sky, dawn not yet having fully broken. The lake was perfectly calm, the grey surface gently stippled like chiselled stone, and all was still but for the gentle rocking of the water beneath them, and the distant sound of Baldwin snoring below decks. Somewhat taken aback to find Peppercorn already at the stove, frying hunks of the black bread in bacon fat, he made his way toward the galley and hailed the boy with a hearty good morning. Surprised in his turn to see the old man approaching, not to mention a little sad to have his solitude disturbed, Peppercorn speared a chunk of bread, sizzling upon the end of the fork with which he had been turning them, and offered it up to him. "I'm glad to see you are no slugabed," said Elisanda, gingerly taking the steaming bread between finger and thumb in order to not burn himself. "Those of my ilk can ill afford such luxuries as lying in," replied Peppercorn, taking a hunk of bread for himself. "Those who stay abed don't eat," he explained, and so saying he gave a smart pull on the rope of the brass bell that hung above the galley, setting the clapper to ringing and adding his own voice to the din, shouted, "Come on, you lazy laggards, up and at 'em, we've work to be a-doing." Elisanda smiled to himself to hear so small a boy take such command. "Food never tastes better than when eaten out of doors," said Elisanda, taking a bite and chewing on the salty charred bread. "Thus speaks one accustomed to eating his meals beneath the shelter of a roof," observed Peppercorn, not taking his eyes from the frying pan he tended. "A man without the benefit of a roof beneath which to eat would never say such a thing." And he gave another sharp clang of the galley bell. "A fair point," the mage conceded, chuckling to himself at the astuteness of the boy, popping the last morsel of hot bread into his mouth. "Look lively!" Peppercorn snapped at the tousled heads that had begun to emerge from the hatch in the foredeck. "Don't scold so, Pepper," entreated Vane Giles. "You know how it is to be sleeping in a hammock. It's like being rocked in your mother's arms." "For all you know of mothers," Peppercorn retorted cordially, for he did indeed know the advantage of sleeping in a gently rocking hammock, and that Vane Giles had not known a mother nor her arms for as long as he could remember. "Well, I hope you're satisfied of your sleep, since now your breakfast is burnt to blackness," he said, offering the sizzling pan to each of his friends in turn. "'Twere black in the first place, Pep," put in Cress in the neck, who took a hearty bite of his bread and then wiped the grease from his lips on the back of his already grubby sleeve. By now the crew of the Farthing were not the only ones up and facing the day. The sun itself was peeping from beneath the eastern horizon and had begun its climb up into the sky. They remained where they were, anchored a day sailing north of Laketown and a mile or so off the western shore for what remained of the morning, while the crew embarked on their daily chores. Though the Farthing had clearly seen better days, it had seen no better owner than Peppercorn, for he was fastidious in keeping her clean and tidy, and made sure that each of his crew, himself no less included, had a number of jobs to do each morning to ensure it was well maintained. Sails and rigging were serviced and any necessary repairs made. Decks were scrubbed and sluiced and rubbed with stiff bristled brushes. Any leaks that were found were plugged with wooden pegs and oakum. Metal items were scoured of rust and oil. Pots and pans in the galley were scrubbed clean with lake water. Coiled ropes were kept in order, and any frayed ends were newly whipped. Once jobs were completed, Peppercorn ordered the anchor raised, and they continued once more northward. There was little breeze that morning, leaving their sail hanging lifeless upon its beam, and so they drifted instead, inching slowly toward their goal. They could have drawn out the oars, of course, and put their backs into achieving a more nimble pace, but it was a beautiful, blue-skied morning, now the sun was up, and Peppercorn did not feel inclined to put his crew to the trouble of it. They in turn took a moment to rest upon the freshly scrubbed deck, to enjoy the bright morning sun, and to fill a pipe or two. Relaxing in this way, it did not take long before their conversation turned once more to the subject of the dragon and where beneath the surface of the wide lake they were to find him. "The history books say that at one time the bones of the dragon could be seen," explained Elisanda, "beneath the water's surface when the tides were low of a summer-time. That was hundreds of years since. Now the waters in the lake are much higher, and knowledge of the exact whereabouts of the dragon's grave has been lost." "I'm sure the lake holds many sunken and hidden treasures," conceded Peppercorn. "But how exactly do you suppose we find this particular one? Where would we start?" And he swept his arm across the great expanse of the lake. It was true, there had been treasures and objects of rare and curious beauty found on the bed of the lake. Everyone knew the tale of Dougal the fisherman who pulled up the crown of Caradog on his fishing net. But instead of enjoying the fortune he made from the sale of the crown, he had spent the rest of his days trawling the lake for more treasure until the day he died, frustrated and friendless. "There are maps," the mage explained, "detailed charts supposedly pinpointing the last resting place of the mighty dragon. I have seen them for myself. But think about it. If these charts were to be trusted, Smaug's treasure would have been retrieved from the lake's bottom many years since, and to my knowledge that has not yet happened." "Or perhaps it hasn't yet been found because it doesn't exist," added Giles wryly. "Had you thought of that?" The mage did not dignify this remark with a reply. They had moved beyond such objections, he decided. You needn't worry yourselves over location, he continued, ignoring Giles's misgivings. I have that all in hand. I have studied this particular treasure for many years, poring over maps and charts, collecting all the information I could, reading the accounts of those who were there at the time of the dragon and left their written testimony of the events, and I have worked out to the best of my knowledge the spot where it is most likely to lie. And what if you're wrong? Asked Peppercorn. What if we don't find your treasure? You will be paid anyway, assured Elisanda, understanding the point of the boy's question. I have gold enough if need be. By now the mage's pipe had burned out, so he set about tapping out the ashes and scraping out the bowl with a small fruit knife that he kept about his person for the purpose. Onto the clean deck, would you believe, much to the disgust of Cresson, whose job it had been to scrub it that morning. I've spent the past many years, the old man continued as he busied himself with the pipe, searching out and studying all the accounts of Smaug's attack and his burning of Laketown. I have found several, and they contradict each other on many points, but they all agree in one respect. He had finished with the cleaning of his pipe, and so he tucked it through the belt of his tunic. The fruit knife he returned to one of the pockets concealed within his sleeve. And what respect is that? Asked Peppercorn, when it began to look as though the mage would not complete his thought. And what respect is what? Asked the mage. You were just saying how the several accounts of the dragon all agreed in one respect. Was I? Oh yes, well, as I was saying, they all agreed in one respect, that when Bard's black arrow pierced the dragon's breast and sent him screaming from the sky in rage and agony, he plunged headlong into the very centre of the burning city and was swallowed up by the lake in a storm of steam and ash and embers. So what are we doing here? Asked Cresson. We should go back to the city and look in the waters beneath it. No, corrected the mage. The accounts all speak of the old city, not the new. The Laketown in which you live is the new city, the one that was built after the old city burned. The new city was not built upon the exact same spot as the old, but a mile or so to the south. Where the old city sat is now open water. Then how will we know where to look? Asked Peppercorn once more. There is no trace of the old city, and any timbers that were not consumed by dragonfire would have rotted away hundreds of years ago. I have studied many maps of the Long Lake, explained the mage. Old maps, maps of great antecedents, crafted during the Third Age, and from my findings, I believe I can pinpoint the location of the original city. Taking a rolled map from his bag, Elisanda spread it out on the deck before him, holding down the corners with whatever came to hand. Immediately Peppercorn recognised the representation of the Long Lake and the regions round about. Then from his bag the mage took a pair of brass compasses and a curious brass instrument constructed of an eye lens, mirrors, scales and fulcrum. Setting the limbs of the compass to the scale at the edge of the map, he proceeded to walk them carefully and deliberately across the inked landscape, first one way, then another, all the time counting under his breath each of the steps, calculating the distance travelled and muttering to himself that, yes, that all seems right. He then took up the brass contraption and, walking to the boat's rail, held it to his eye and looked out to the open water while turning dials and adjusting the angle of the mirrors. What magic is that? Asked Peppercorn as he watched Elisanda scanning the horizon and skyline. Not magic, the mage replied, absent-mindedly, absorbed in his work. Science. It is a tool for calculating distance and direction. And what does it tell you? Asked Baldwin. The mage did not answer directly, but turned the dials again and looked once more through the eye lens, first to the west and then the south. Then he hurried back to the map and began tracing a line, first this way, then that way with his finger. Finally he said, It tells me that this is the place, and so saying he stabbed his finger down onto the map. And where exactly is that? Asked Peppercorn. It is here, replied the mage, opening wide his arms. This is the place, right here where now we are. How do you know? Asked Nickel. Oh, I feel it in my bones, replied the mage, and what an old man's bones tell him are rarely worth disputing. This conversation was interrupted of a sudden by Dimmock. He was not huddled with his companions around the map. He stood instead at the prow rail on the foredeck, looking out across the lake. Looks like we have company, he called, while at the same time pointing off into the southern distance. Following the direction of his gesture, they could clearly see, toward the horizon, a single black sail, signifying a vessel of some kind, in all likelihood a small one, no bigger than their own. It was the first such vessel they had seen since leaving the fishing fleet. Observing the distant sail with uncertainty, the mage spat overboard, just as he had done when passing by the steps of the temple. He no doubt sensed that this sail brought with it bad luck, both for the small boat and its crew. I wonder what they are doing there, Peppercorn mused aloud, straining his eyes in the direction of the mystery boat, searching it for any signs of life. They're not fishing, said Baldwin, who had gone to join Nickel at the rail, that much is for sure. Nor's it a cargo vessel, added Cresson, 'tain't big enough. Just out for pleasure, no doubt, said Peppercorn. though he wasn't sure he actually believed that himself, for they were a long way from Laketown, or from the western shore for that matter. All this time, Elisandra had said nothing, and wrapped as they were with the sight of the boat, none of the boys noticed the shadow of misgiving that had fallen across his face. They paid the distant vessel no more attention, for they had work to be about, and so they got on with the job at hand. When several hours later it was still there, having not moved a cable length to east or west, their suspicions were further aroused. Why would this little boat be at anchor miles from Laketown? It was as mysterious as was the reason for their being there themselves. I cannot help thinking, replied Elisandra gravely when Peppercorn asked again, that their purpose for being out here is not so very different from our own. You mean the treasure? Asked Baldwin, in the tone of one scandalised. Of course, replied the mage, but in truth he did not mean the treasure at all, but just one item of the treasure, the mysterious talisman in which he himself was so interested. They slept that night as they had on previous nights, the mage in Peppercorn's little cabin at the stern, while Pepper and his crew berthed in the 'tween deck beneath the deck hatch. There was but one exception. This night they set a watch who remained alert and watchful. I don't want to wake up to find I've been murdered in my sleep, said Baldwin, and so Dimmock, Peppercorn's first mate, was given the first watch that night. The lake remained calm throughout the night, and the Farthing rocked gently at anchor upon the languid waters. Still, Peppercorn slept only fitfully, tossing and turning in his hammock, his dreams troubled by an array of disturbing images. As he slept, he dreamed that someone was aboard the boat, some dark, shadowy figure, clothed all in black, its face and features obscured from view. And as Peppercorn lay in his bed, and those of his crew slept heedlessly in theirs, the shadowy figure moved silently amongst them, stooped and sly, cloaked in darkness like a shade, or like some creeping villain, wringing its clawed hands and hissing to itself dark words that Peppercorn could not quite hear or make out. And the creature stole amongst them, going from one to the next of the sleeping bundles of rag, leaning low over them in their beds, as if searching for something in their faces. When he came to Peppercorn, it was like being cast in shadow, and he could see nothing but a pair of dark eyes, searching eyes that burned with intense fervour and bored down into his own. He felt the damp warmth of its breath upon his face and heard the sibilant whisper of its muffled and pernicious voice. "This is the one," it hissed. "This is the one."